So I am especially excited about this episode because you guys get to meet one of my workplace besties, Jose Bourget. Yeah, he's here in the flesh. I like when all the worlds collide and my like online friends get to meet my real life friends. So this is a moment for me. So Jose, I want everybody, like, as we have this conversation, no pressure, but I just want them all to understand why we have so much fun together. You know what I mean?
They will see and they will witness. They will be a cloud of witnesses to the energy that is shared between these two spaces right here.
Andrews University is going to get so many applications after this episode airs because people are going to be like, I want to be Heather and Jose's workplace besties. Okay, so to start the show, I always pull something that somebody posted online. I do online digging and stalking for you because my husband also is part of this bromance, and he loved this sermon that you did. I think you did it last year, right? It's not even new. It's not even new, but he still talks about it. And when I was talking to you on the podcast, he was like, you have to talk to him about the sermon he did. So instead of pulling a quote from something you posted online, I'm going to pull a quote from your sermon that was posted online. Don't worry, y'all. I will put this sermon in the show notes so you can also listen to it after. But here's the quote. You say this, Jose. Neurodivergent brains experience a moment of anxiety, and in an effort to explain that anxiety, may take something small and make it something much bigger. This is how we create monsters. It is a way to make sense of the experience. So, can you talk to me and all of my friends about what are monsters? Because this is what, after you talked about it, Seth, he references back to this all the time.
So actually, I got that idea from a book that I read. It's called Your Brain's Not Broken. It was it was such a valuable book for me to be able to read because I felt like I was reading about myself and my whole life. And until that moment, I had not quite understood why simple tasks or a simple exchange or someone's minimal expectation would suddenly become so hard for me to be able to process, to interact with, to be able to achieve. Something as simple as I need to call the insurance and update my premium became something that took days and weeks, but because it became a monster, right? It just grew into this oversized thing that I could not work through. And I think part of the reason is because neurodivergent as opposed to convergent thinking, right? These are kind of the two different ways that people tend to process the world. But also divergent people just means also that they're not neurotypical. They don't process the world in the standard ways that most of the people process the world. But neurodivergent thinkers in particular are creative problem solvers. They don't get excited about answers. They actually don't get excited about the fastest way from point A to point B. And when you have ADHD, you need that dopamine drive. So in some ways, to find your motivation, you almost have to create a monster because that dopamine rush can definitely help you get the thing done that you need to get done. It's just how it becomes interesting. But what many of us experience is emotional deregulation. So we have ADHD, we function from a neurodivergent ways. We don't have the atypical ways that we get things done. We try to be very imaginative. We start with questions rather than solutions. And so without the emotional regulation that happens, the thing that has become something imaginative, creative problem solving, just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it becomes so big, we can't do anything about it. We are literally terrified, overwhelmed, anxiety stricken, instant depression. I can't do this. And it's like the most medial of tasks. So that is this idea of a monster is you oh man, there was I don't know if you ever were seeing one of those The Incredibles, the Pixar, and yeah.
Of course, I've seen we were the Incredibles one Halloween, my whole family.
Yeah, and then there's this scene where they're like throwing these bubbles at this guy to help slow him down, some sort of gel bubble, and it took bubble after bubble after bubble until they finally were able to freeze the monster. Well, that's kind of what happens when you get stuck with the monster. You keep building it and building it and building it, and it totally immobilizes you, and you're stuck and you're frozen by fear, by anxiety, so on and so forth. So that's the idea of the monsters, that you take something that could be very simple, could have a very clear, specific answer, but in your imaginative, inventive mind, in your neurodivergent mind, where you're driven by imagination and questions, you make this thing so big that you can't even handle it anymore. So that's kind of what happens.
How does that how does that impact your daily life? Because I'm even that vocabulary of monsters for Seth, who also has ADHD, has been incredibly helpful because I mean, it can be something as small as texting, but definitely almost every time we leave any type of social event, the entire way home, his brain starts running through what maybe somebody's facial expression did about, and then he's thinking, well, maybe I offended them with what I said. Do you think this is offensive? And he's running through the entire scenario. And I say, oh my goodness, this has to be really exhausting. That every time you're having interactions, you're running through what somebody maybe could have interpreted wrong and making it bigger. How has that impacted your daily life? And actually, I want to ask you this question too, because you work in ministry. I can think now, like, now that we have the vocabulary, I can think of so many times for Seth, this is what was happening in his ministry, right? How has that impacted, like, after you do a sermon, how does that impact you?
Yeah, yeah. So, by the way, everything you just said about Seth is one of the things that I love most about him. So sorry if we have these bromance moments in this in this podcast, but yeah, yeah.
Yes, no. I'm so grateful. This vocabulary, Jose, I'm not kidding. When you first talked about this with him, it has really been transformative, and that's why I wanted to do this episode.
So I think the how this impacts us is very distinct to the individual, probably. And what you've just described about Seth is that Seth is a highly empathetic person who has a strong desire to be a positive influence and impact the people that are in his lives and that he interacts with them, right? So he walks out of those spaces because now he's concerned: did I doing that, right? So he's kind of reevaluating whether he actually was able to achieve that thing, and doesn't I and if I think, because he is a highly kind, empathetic individual. For me, like after the sermon, um, I I don't like negative feedback after a sermon, but I do go watch it a day later, and then I get the constructive feedback afterwards, so on and so forth. In my everyday life, the practice right now, actually, since using the language of monster, is being able to recognize this thing has become a monster. Just being able to name the pain, right? You name the pain, and it's actually quite liberating because now I'm thinking, okay, no, this is. Let me just get this back down to the simplest task possible, or the simplest interaction possible, or let me remind myself of the core value that's functioning in this space. But just being able to identify that this is a monster in the making is the thing that helps me to slow it down in this moment when I'm confronting it in my everyday life. Of course, there are times when I just let the monster stay at a medium size, not the super size, and then I live with it, and then I have a steady dose of anxiety that drives my week until and Heather, I love the Sabbath. I believe in the seventh day where we take a rest. I believe everyone needs to take a rest and to breathe. For me, my monsters have resolved themselves in unhealthy ways through busyness. So I remember last year talking with you and Seth and just saying, um, "Man, I got back into my addiction, and my addiction is an unhealthy way of coping. The way that I've dealt with my monsters is through busyness, serious workaholic busyness. It's so it's avoidance upon avoidance upon avoidance. So there's an issue in my life, there's a monster in my life. Let me go distract myself with something else. That becomes too big. I go into the next monster. Let me distract myself with something bigger and bigger, and it just keeps compounding. It just keeps compounding. And so addictions is where have been the unhealthy ways that I have dealt with my monsters in the past, and that addiction has been workaholic, just hustling, hustling, hustling. Also trying to find my sense of value through the hustle. If I'm working hard and I'm impacting people and I'm managing, one of the colleagues that I started working with early on noticed this about me, that I was just quantifying my value by the hours that I was putting in. So one of the things that I've had to do to mitigate this monster is to be clear about the things that give me value and worth, and taking time every morning, taking a pause through the course of the day, just to remind myself, man, uh, God loves me just as I am. I have value because I am a child of God. Is one of the ways that I make sure that I'm not trying to find my value in other things, right? And it helps me to mitigate my monsters. Having a Sabbath reset where I say to myself, whatever the thing is that is worrying me, that is giving me anxiety, that is giving me that is bothering me, I'm going to take 24 hours a break from this thing, or a 2 hour break. A few years ago, I went through a really difficult time. I went through a divorce, and I would show up as a pastor going through divorce. My congregation didn't know. My senior pastor knew, literally experiencing deep levels of depression and anxiety. But I exercised a couple of things of personal practices that really helped me through that situation. And one was that Sabbath morning when I walked inside of church, Saturday morning when I would walk inside of church, I said, I leave all my troubles at the door. That's it. I'm not any thought, any negative thought, I leave it at the door, and I'm going to be fully invested in the moment that's right in front of me. And that was, for some people, sometimes when they go through trauma, they don't go to church. For me, it was the exact opposite. I went to church and I was able to find peace in that and settle the monsters for just a couple of hours. And I think that's one of the key things about monsters and emotional regulation is reflecting on what are the things that help you to calm. What are the thought patterns that help you to put things in check? Who's a good accountability partner for you that will speak truth into your life, right? Be present with what you're doing, but also help you to, like, pretty much, simmer down. Sorry, that was like a lot in that moment.